Welcome back. Today we'll be looking at women and the American Revolution. So you had a reading that does a really good job addressing many of the roles that women took during the revolution. So I just want to address a little bit before and after the revolution. So I'll just add to that conversation. In addition, I want to address the concept of modern feminism. Modern in the sense of 18th century feminism. Because what we call feminism today is very different from this era. However, this kind of sets the foundation of what will emerge as feminism today. So I do want to kind of touch on that before I talk about women in the American Revolution. So the goals for today is number one, address some women that were involved in the revolution. Again, the reading does a very good job addressing that. And, not only does the reading do this, but I'll talk about this too, how everyday activities are significant and play a very important role in the revolution. And this goes to that whole question of should women had received the vote early on because they were instrumental in helping the colonies secede from Britain. So, and it's a bit revisionist, but do those actions call to give women the vote and make them equal citizens as men? Because without the women, the men would have lost. And again, the reading talks about the important role that they took. We're going to talk about women's agency during the revolution. So definitely, again, the reading talks about some great examples of their involvement. And I already addressed this, right? Should this participation equal citizenship? And unfortunately, it took another 120 years, right, for women to have equality in regards to voting in the United States. And it's something that many people kind of question, well, should this have happened earlier? Understand too that when it came to the vote, particularly early on, 1776 forward, it was only white middle-class men who got it. If you were poor, you did not have a say until the Jacksonian era. So a lot of people were kind of left out. And obviously the Constitution has been interpreted differently since then. That way it kind of gives equal access to these different groups for enfranchisement, right? So. And then lastly, I want to address the concept of feminist thought. Oh, I forgot the T right there. Sorry about that. And kind of look at how Mrs. Adams addresses her husband. And the argument that she makes is very important. Addressing this idea of, man, you're complaining about people stepping on you. What about us, right? Don't forget the women. So it's an important element of what we call feminism today. So before we dig into women in the American Revolution, I want to start by addressing the development of feminist thought. Now, at least in Western culture, it comes from Europe. Throughout history, women have been perceived as, second-class citizens, and it's for multiple reasons. Not just religion, though religion plays an important role. I talked about patriarchy, right? Patriarchy kind of sets the tone that women are subservient to men. But in the Middle Ages, you begin to see how religion also uses that kind of rhetoric to justify that women are the weaker sex. If you recall last week's reading with witchcraft and how they use the Bible to justify that women were created to serve men, correct? So throughout history, religion has been used as this kind of absolute truth, right, quote unquote, that women are the weaker sex. And this is based on, from what we read, right? But again, if you read the Bible, it's in there too, that women are perceived to be prone to vice. They're easily, persuaded. And they just, they use their sexuality to their advantage. So these texts are used to justify why women should be viewed as dependent and women should not be trusted. Understand that when the Bible was created, it could have gone many ways. There's some books out there that were quite progressive, such as the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, that kind of advocated for women. And, the church fathers, or the people who put the Bible together, kind of said, no, this gives women too much freedom. So, let's get rid of that book and have these other books. So there's a whole history to that, and you could take religious studies and they dig into those subjects. But I just want to give you an example of how these texts are used, not as some absolute truth, but really for people's own political sway. Kind of a key thinker in the Middle Ages is Thomas Aquinas. If we all go to EMCC, if you go down the street, there's a church called Thomas Aquinas. And he writes a piece called Summa Theologica, which basically kind of argues this idea that women are, this kind of weaker sex. Women are perceived in this lens, right, of good versus bad, as we read with the Castañeda piece, the virgin-whore dichotomy, right? Women are put into one of these two categories, yet men are not, right? The actions are the same, yet men, their identity is much more, I guess, unique, if you will, right? It's independent of each other. Whereas for women, you're put into these two major categories, and one being the good virginous woman, while the other one is viewed as, the bad woman in society, right? The one who's sexually available, the one who manipulates men and so forth, right? The one that you don't marry, basically. And this has been part of our Western culture. It's so ingrained in us that we, it's still there, even though people have been fighting against it. It still resonates, and obviously men use it to their advantage. So these are kind of ideological, even theological arguments. But you even have, particularly in the 1800s, the scientific world of that era kind of argue that women are the weaker sex. And a lot of it has to do with the way that, some of these early scientists began to look at women's bodies, particularly their anatomy, where, you have things like craniometry, where women's skulls are a little bit smaller than men's on average. So they begin to argue that, well, men have bigger heads, therefore they can have more brain matter, and ergo, they must be smarter, right? Or the way our anatomy is different, right? Women have wider hips, therefore they are perceived to be good for giving birth, right? Men don't do that. So that's, again, these are kind of justifications to argue that women are inferior to men. So we put science in in quotes, because it's that science of that era. It's very problematic. However, in the 17th century, you begin to see groups challenge that idea. You have the emergence of what's called the Enlightenment Era. This is happening both in the States and the United States and in Europe, mostly in Europe. And there's a sense of skepticism. Many of them are not so much anti-religion, but they just don't think that God is, always watching you, trying to control every aspect of your life. They believe that he exists, but he does not set the rules. So this concept of what's called deism. There's a sense of skepticism, right? That they begin to attack superstition, religious superstition in particular. And at least the Enlightenment era, which is a very middle-class movement during this period, people like Voltaire, Diderot, and so forth, began to be much more secular, right? So religion plays a role, but not that important role in people's lives. They actually question religion. They believe that reason, unlike religion, because religion is based mostly on nothing, right, besides belief, they believe that reason could uncover certain natural laws that govern different aspects of our life. And if we can uncover these rules, these natural laws, then society will be a better place, right? Whereas religion, it's more of like, don't do that, and then you ask why, and somebody replies, because I said so. I mean, that's not a natural law, that's not justification, that's just somebody who doesn't want you to do something, right? And it's based on absolutely nothing besides blind faith, if you will. Now, most of this Enlightenment era emerges because people in a lower class, not the lowest class, but just people a class below the nobility, begin to question the power of kings, of absolute kings, absolute rulers. So it's really this kind of middle class fighting to have a voice in places like England and France and Prussia during this period. So they're kind of saying, why is it that the nobility has so much political voice, yet we men from the middle class have none? So that's where kind of this Enlightenment movement emerges, and after that kind of branches out and addresses multiple subjects. So some of their goals, they varied. It wasn't a uniform movement like the civil rights or something like that. Every writer had their own agenda, basically. But there are certain things that kind of tie them together, such as the belief that there must be a check and balances between a king and its people, right? That you must separate the different branches of government so that way one person doesn't have complete political sway. So checks and balances, I think Montague promoted that idea. Another important element is that they believe that natural laws should govern us, that we implemented so much belief and religion into our government system that we went away from natural law. And there's certain laws that just exist, and if we can uncover those again, then we can make a better society. They believe in sexual liberation. So somebody like Diderot, he argued basically that, why is it that we practice monogamy? It doesn't make sense from a biological or again, using natural law type of arguments, because the body wants what the body wants, right? And following religion, you have to jump all these hoops and so forth and so on in order to be with somebody, when nature doesn't require you to do that. Nature just has these internal needs, and it calls on you to engage in these type of relationships. So he was all about open relationships, right? Some of these guys were kind of sleeping around with a lot of people. But again, it's a natural urge that we all have, men, women, right? Everybody has this natural urge, and religion just puts all these blocks not to engage in these type of acts based on belief, right? Because somebody said so, or maybe some book said so. They believe in economic freedom. During this time you have, what's the word? I forgot the name of the word, but you have an economic system where countries are protecting their own economic interests. And in doing so, they end up hurting their economies and other parts of other communities' economies. So they believe that the free market should reign. So laissez-faire was an element of this, some of these ideals of the Enlightenment era. And what's important to us here is feminism, right? For the first time, we see somebody going to argue that women have the ability to reason just like any other man. Though throughout history have many great examples of women being great rulers, women writing great scholarship, women participating in war. But it was always perceived that these were exceptions rather than a rule. So yeah, you have Cleopatra, but that's one out of how many, right? And what these feminists are arguing is like we all have that ability. However, men are the ones who are stifling us from being full participants of a community. So again, this is the first time you see that argument. So there's a few, there's a few people who kind of argue this point. Most of the Enlightenment era thinkers would argue that women were inferior. And again, that's why I said it's not a cohesive movement. But you do have exceptions, and then you do have women themselves who are advocating for their rights. So one of them is Mary Astell, and she writes this piece called A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, where she argues that if you educate a woman, it benefits the relationship. So she's not quite, I guess we would call her proto-feminist at this particular juncture, because she's not intellectualizing it in a ideological form, but she is advocating that women should have access to education. During this era, a lot of times women were educated through their fathers, or kind of like a not going through formal education, but rather getting an indirect education. You would have what they would call salons, where all the Enlightenment thinkers would get together, like a coffee house, talk about their work, and it was mostly women who would host these salons where all these men would get together, and women were there, right? Women were participating and in the discussion, so they would get an informal education in that way. Probably the most significant one is Mary Wollstonecraft, and she writes this very famous piece called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, sorry, where she argues that women are subjected to men's control, which she perceives to be wrong. And it's a great piece. She kind of follows Mary Astell's argument that, look, if you educate women, it makes her a better citizen. Because she says women are often taught from infancy to focus on their body, right? To focus on their beauty for the goal of getting a husband. Now, let's say you marry well, right? Some beautiful woman marries well. Her husband provides her with everything that she needs. In the end, he always sees it like it's going to be his stuff, or he did it for you, rather than you doing it on your own. So you live in this kind of what she calls a gilded cage, right? It's a cage that's adorned with all the glitter and gold that you want, but it's a prison nonetheless. And then what happens when you get to a certain age where you're no longer viewed as beautiful? Well, sometimes their husbands leave them. So she says, look, if you make us a better citizen, you're going to like us more. Not because of our beauty or something like that, but because we can connect in a deeper level. It makes us, therefore, a better citizen. So she makes this argument in this piece that is advocating for women's rights. She also shows that the only reason why women are not educated and do these things and try to look beautiful and so forth, it's not because they're incapable of doing it, but rather because they are trained to do that from a very early age. And many of us go through that, right? I'm not sure how many of you from a very young age were taught kind of focus on your wedding day, right? I'm not sure if anybody out there that's listening to this kind of said, wow, I can't wait till the day I get married. I'm going to look, and wear this dress, and my place is, whatever. The church is going to look this way. I'm going to have these flowers. The cake is going to look like that, and so forth and so on, right? Well, part of it has to do because we've been taught, right? We've been institutionalized to think this way. At least women have. So you kind of put yourself in this cage sometimes. At least throughout history, not you personally, but women throughout history have been put here. And Mary Wollstonecraft says, no, it's not our fault. It's men's fault. However, give us the opportunity to be educated, and we can be good partners in the relationship. So I'm going to post a link about one of her ideological argument that addresses this idea in a comical way. It's like a 3-minute philosophy video. That way you can get an idea of what she's kind of proposing, in case I didn't explain it here. All right, so let's stop it there, and so you can watch that video, and we'll come back to the American Revolution.